Have you ever wondered why the Roman Empire spent astronomical sums on bloody entertainment? Most people believe that gladiatorial combat was simply senseless slaughter for the amusement of an uneducated and brutal crowd. But in reality, it was the most sophisticated, profitable, and complex business of the ancient world. The modern entertainment industry and professional esports look like child's play compared to what took place in the Colosseum. The Romans turned death into a perfect mathematical formula where every fighter was a meticulously calculated commercial venture. And this is where things get really interesting. In those days, training a single elite gladiator cost as much as maintaining an entire platoon of the regular army. School owners, known as lanisti, invested colossal sums in their fighters, providing them with the best doctors. They even had their own special diet, which modern sports trainers would call ideal for bulking up. These guys ate tons of barley and legumes every day to build up a thick layer of fat over their steel muscles. Why did they need this strange spare tire around their waist before entering the arena? Because in close combat, the fat acted as extra armor, protecting vital organs from shallow but painful cuts. Today, we'll break down the deadliest types of these ancient fighters, step by step. We'll see how each class was meticulously crafted for a specific, unique style of killing and survival. We'll discover why some gladiators wore heavy armor, while others entered the arena practically naked. You'll understand why their weapons and tactics worked the way they did, and how they defied the norms of their time. This is the story of how human ingenuity was harnessed to create the perfect assembly line of spectacular death. Get ready to dive into a world where your life depended on how well you knew your enemy's weaknesses. We'll break down each fighter the way modern sports analysts analyze champions' tactics before a major match. We'll reveal the real, dirty, and brutal secrets of the ancient arena that aren't covered in school textbooks. You'll see gladiators not as mindless victims, but as top-tier professionals in their deadly craft. Let's begin our analysis of the most brutal killing machines of the ancient world. To understand the genius of gladiatorial combat, you need to stop thinking of it as a simple street fight. It was a carefully calibrated system that most closely resembled the modern concept of rock, paper, scissors. Each fighter had a strength that perfectly countered another's weakness, creating an endless cycle of intrigue. If you gave everyone identical swords and shields, the spectators would have fallen asleep by the third match. The Romans quickly realized this and began experimenting with formats until they found the perfect balance of classes. The very idea of classes evolved over decades, undergoing brutal tests on the blood of real people. At first, they were simply captured soldiers who fought with the same weapons with which they had been taken prisoner. But over time, the organizers realized that some historical weapon sets simply didn't work in a circular arena. The legionary style of formation combat was too cramped for duels because it was designed for battle lines, not for a show. Therefore, the lanists began modifying armor and weapons, making them less practical for war, but more spectacular. Herein lies the most striking detail of this entire ancient industry. Almost all gladiator helmets covered the fighter's face with a solid visor featuring tiny eye slits. Why hide the face of a man who was supposed to become a superstar and the favorite of millions of spectators? Because it was much easier for the spectators and the opposing gladiator to watch a faceless archetype die rather than a specific person. When you cannot see your opponent's eyes, you are fighting a metal monster, not a frightened man. It was an ancient psychological trick to lower empathy. The weapons were also selected with incredible sadistic cunning to drag out the fight as long as possible. If the fighters were given swords that were too long, the duel would end in 10 seconds with a single successful thrust. This is completely unprofitable for the organizers, who spent a fortune on renting the Colosseum and advertising. That's why most gladiators were given short blades, forcing them to get as close as possible into intimate range. You literally had to feel your enemy's breath to deliver a fatal blow. Now take a look at the distribution of armor, because it's simply a masterpiece of game design from that era. The Romans almost never protected their gladiators' torsos and abdomens with sturdy metal plates. Armor covered only the parts of the body that were most often severed, the leading hand and the front leg. This was done so that the fight wouldn't end with an accidental limb injury right at the start of the round. Spectators wanted to see blood from the torso, and an exposed chest guaranteed them that dramatic spectacle. This entire balance was maintained by a strict system of paired matches, where everyone knew their traditional rival. There were classic duels that were repeated from century to century, much like favorite TV series with a familiar plot. The spectators knew each participant's strengths and weaknesses in advance. And that's exactly what made the betting so thrilling. People in the stands argued until they were hoarse, debating whether a heavy shield could withstand a series of rapid strikes. It was analysis on par with modern sports shows, only with real severed limbs in the finale. Sometimes, of course, the organizers would throw in surprises and mix classes into unconventional, exotic combinations to stoke interest. But this happened rarely, because such experiments often ended in the overly quick or absurd death of one of the fighters. It turned out that the classic balance was so well calibrated that any deviations only spoiled the quality of the show. Modern developers spend years releasing patches for their games to fine-tune the balance between characters. The Romans fine-tuned their balance 2,000 years ago, using human lives instead of computers. Interestingly, the gladiators themselves also understood the mechanics of their classes perfectly and adapted their bodies to them. A heavyweight fighter would artificially slow his breathing and learn to conserve energy in every movement. A light fighter trained for explosive speed by running around the arena with weights on his legs all day long. They were narrow specialists who knew only one single job, but did it better than anyone else in the empire. And if a light fighter was forced to carry a heavy shield, he turned into a completely helpless target. In fact, that is precisely why the Roman entertainment system lasted so unbearably long without losing its popularity. They sold the audience the illusion of a fair fight, where wit and tactics could always triumph over brute force. Each duel told its own little story about overcoming weaknesses and exploiting the opponent's slightest mistakes. You could visit the amphitheater 100 times and never see two fights that were exactly alike. Now let's take a closer look at these deadly performers, starting with the heaviest of them all. Imagine a classic tank from any modern multiplayer game. It's a huge, unwieldy beast whose sole purpose is to absorb massive damage and slowly plow forward like a road roller. That was exactly what the Murmillo was, the heaviest, most heavily armored, and most resilient fighter on the entire Roman arena. This gladiator entered the arena with a giant rectangular shield called a scutum, which covered him from chin to knee. It was a veritable walking fortress of wood and leather, nearly impossible to pierce with a standard strike. The scutum itself weighed about 10 kilograms, and holding it at arm's length was a true physical ordeal. Try picking up a 10-kilogram weight and swinging it in front of you for at least 5 minutes without stopping. Your shoulder will start begging for mercy, and your forearm will simply refuse to transmit signals from your brain. But the Murmillo didn't just carry this shield, he used it as an active offensive weapon in every battle. He struck the enemy with the metal edge of the shield right in the face, breaking noses and shattering jaws with terrifying force. The weapon of this living tank was the short gladius sword, of which the entire Roman infantry was so proud. The gladius was not designed for flashy slashing strikes, as is often depicted in comic books. It was a thrusting weapon, created for short, brutal, and incredibly effective jabs from behind the edge of the shield. The Murmillo hid behind his wooden wall, waited for his opponent's mistake, and delivered a single lightning-fast thrust to the abdomen. Modern surgeons say that a stab wound from such a sword left virtually no chance of survival in ancient conditions. Perched on this fighter's head was a massive, heavy helmet with a distinctive high crest shaped like a fish fin. In fact, the class's very name derives from the word Murmillos, which refers to a specific type of sea fish. This helmet weighed about 4 kilograms and had tiny slits for vision, which made the fighter nearly blind. Why put on a bucket that makes it hard to breathe and blocks your view? Because this helmet perfectly protected the head from any slashing blows from above, turning the Murmillos into an invulnerable turtle. True, this incredible protection came at a terrible, deadly price in the sun-drenched arena. In such heavy gear, the Murmillos overheated at an alarming rate, like a kettle left on the stove. The Colosseum, under the scorching Italian sun, turned into an oven, and the fighter inside his armor lost liters of sweat. If the fight dragged on for more than 15 minutes, the Murmillo could simply collapse from heat stroke. His main weakness was not his opponent's sword, but his own sluggishness and colossal energy expenditure. Therefore, the Murmillo's tactics were incredibly simple, but required iron discipline and nerves of steel. He had to take the center of the arena, adopt a defensive stance, and force his opponent to waste energy on futile attacks. He absorbed the blows with his shield, conserved every move, and waited until his opponent was gasping for breath from exhaustion. In modern boxing, this is called the counterpuncher style, where you wear down your opponent before the decisive knockout. And when the lighter fighter made a mistake due to fatigue, the Murmillo took a single step forward and ended the fight. Interestingly, the Murmillo's right hand, in which he held his deadly sword, was protected by special quilted armor, the manica. This piece looked like a thick sleeve made of leather and linen, tightly wrapped around the forearm. It protected the most vulnerable part of the body from accidental cuts, allowing the fighter to face counterattacks without fear. The left leg, which was always thrust forward behind the shield, was covered by a metal greave. The Romans knew exactly where their enemies would strike and armored only these critical areas. It sounds as if it was impossible to kill this guy fairly, doesn't it? But Roman organizers never allowed an unfair advantage in their perfect arena. The Murmillo was strong in a head-on clash, but he was completely helpless against attacks from unexpected angles. His heavy shield severely limited his peripheral vision, making him vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. And it was precisely to cut open these armored tanks that the next utterly insane class of gladiators was created. Now imagine you need to destroy a tank, but they won't give you an anti-tank rifle or a grenade launcher. Instead, they hand you a fishing net and a pitchfork and say, "Go over there, do it right, and try not to die." It was precisely in this situation, absurd at first glance, that the Retiarius found himself, Rome's most unusual and recognizable gladiator. This guy had no shield, no helmet, not even decent pants to protect his legs. He entered the arena practically naked, relying solely on his incredible speed and agility. The Retiarius' main weapon was, oddly enough, a heavy net with lead weights along the edges. This net was called a rete, and throwing it required a level of skill that is hard for modern people to even imagine. If the Retiarius missed, he was left without his main weapon and was forced to flee across the arena. But if the net hit its target, it would tightly entangle a heavy shield, a sword, or even the opponent himself. It's like throwing a blanket over the head of an aggressive dog. The enemy instantly loses his bearings and panics. This trickster's second weapon was a trident called a fascina, which he used to stab his entangled victim. The trident was long, allowing the Retiarius to keep dangerous heavyweights at a comfortable and safe distance from himself. In addition, the trident was incredibly handy for blocking an enemy's sword by clamping the blade between his three sharp prongs. The Retiarius also carried a tiny dagger, which he used to deliver the finishing blow or to cut his net free if an opponent pulled it toward them. This fighter was a walking Swiss Army knife, designed for controlling distance. The craziest thing about the Retiarius' equipment is his single piece of armor, called the galera. It was a tall metal shield that was attached to the left shoulder and protected the neck and lower face. When the Retiarius stood sideways to his opponent, he could use the galera to block a slashing blow simply by shrugging his shoulders. This looks absolutely ridiculous from a military science perspective, but in the arena, it saved lives every day. The galera was the only barrier between the enemy's sword and this swift gladiator's jugular vein. But why did spectators love watching a man running around the arena with fishing gear so much? Because the Retiarius' style was the complete opposite of the Roman military values of steadfastness and head-on attack. A Roman legionary never retreated, while the Retiarius constantly ran away, dodged, and struck from the shadows. The spectators saw in him a cunning fox mocking a clumsy armored bear, and this sparked wild excitement. It was the classic clash of brute force and nimble intellect, a combination that always sells tickets. The Retiarius' tactics required phenomenal cardiovascular endurance, comparable to that of modern marathon runners. He had to keep moving constantly, circling around his heavy opponent, forcing him to turn and expend energy. The Retiarius waited for the moment when his opponent would lose concentration from fatigue and lower his heavy shield. And then came a lightning-fast throw of the net, which in a second decided the outcome of the entire long duel. A single accurate throw transformed a fearsome armored tank into a helpless, tangled fish on the sand. Of course, the Retiarius' status in the gladiatorial hierarchy was rather strange and paradoxical from a moral standpoint. On the one hand, they were the darlings of the public, and their names were often scrawled on the walls of Roman homes by fans. On the other hand, the lack of a helmet meant that a Retiarius could not hide his fear or his emotions during a fight. This made the class somewhat humiliating in the eyes of conservative Romans, who considered an exposed face a sign of weakness and dishonor. But when this fighter won, the crowd roared with delight so loudly that the stone arches of the amphitheater shook. In essence, the Retiarius was the ancient equivalent of a modern sniper. Light, deadly at a distance, but vulnerable in close combat. And just as a special unit is needed to hunt snipers, Rome needed a special fighter. They realized that a standard heavy gladiator was too slow to catch a guy running around the arena without armor. So they created the perfect anti-Retiarius, a fighter whose sole purpose in life was to catch up to and destroy the man with the net. And we're going to talk about this specialized killing machine right now. If the Retiarius was a nimble prey, then the Secutor was created solely to be his ruthless hunter. The very name Secutor translates from Latin as pursuer, and this word perfectly described his behavior in the arena. In terms of build and basic weaponry, he was the heavy Murmillo's twin, but with critical modifications. Roman engineers of death took the heavy fighter and upgraded him so that the Retiarius' net became utterly useless. This class is the clearest example of how the Romans balanced their bloody game against a specific opponent. The main and most striking difference of the Secutor lay in the shape of his incredibly strange helmet. It had no protruding crests, brims, or wide visors, unlike those of other classes. The Secutor's helmet was completely smooth, round, and fit snugly over the head, like a metal egg or a bowling ball. Why would anyone need such a strange, unaesthetic shape that robs the fighter of any intimidating appearance? It's very simple. The Retiarius' net simply slid off the smooth helmet, finding not the slightest foothold. But this perfect protection against nets had one enormous, simply monstrous drawback for the fighter himself. The eye slits in this helmet were so microscopic that the Secutor could see only a narrow strip of light in front of him. Peripheral vision was out of the question. To look to the side, he had to turn his entire body. Furthermore, there was virtually no ventilation inside this solid metal sphere, and the fighter suffocated in his own hot air. Breathing in it was like running a cross-country race with a plastic bag tightly pulled over his head. Therefore, time in battle always worked against the Secutor with the relentlessness of an hourglass. While a Retiarius could run around the arena for hours, the Secutor had to end the fight in a matter of minutes, or he would simply die of suffocation. This was the genius of the balance. The net does not work against the helmet, but the helmet itself slowly kills its owner. The Secutor was obliged to constantly attack, pursue, and pressure the enemy, not giving him a single second to catch his breath. This turned the duel into the most dynamic and adrenaline-fueled race for survival in the entire Roman spectacle. The pursuer's weapon remained the same short and deadly gladius, and his defense, a large rectangular shield. The Secutor moved across the arena in short, aggressive bursts, hiding behind his shield and constantly closing the precious distance. His task was to drive the agile Retiarius into a corner or against the arena wall, where the latter would have nowhere to retreat. Modern boxing coaches call this cutting off the angles, a tactic that requires excellent spatial awareness and relentless pressure. And the Secutors mastered this art better than anyone else in the ancient world. When the Secutor finally pinned his agile victim against the wall, the outcome of the fight was decided in a fraction of a second. In close combat, the Retiarius, with his long trident, didn't stand a chance against the short sword and massive shield. The Secutor would bear down with his full weight, block the trident, and deliver a short, sharp thrust with his gladius to the exposed abdomen. The crowd erupted in applause because the tension of the chase was finally resolved in a bloody finale. It was a true ancient thriller, where the predator caught up with his exhausted prey. But let's be honest, Being a Secutor was a real physical and psychological nightmare. Imagine, you're trapped in a dark, stuffy helmet, sweat is pouring into your eyes, and you can't get enough air to breathe properly. And somewhere ahead, outside your narrow field of vision, a half-naked guy is dancing around, trying to stab your legs with sharp spears. Any mistake, any hesitation meant that the trident would find a gap under your shield or pierce your unprotected thigh. These fighters possessed such iron will that even Roman emperors treated them with deep respect. Fun fact, the famous Emperor Commodus, who loved to enter the arena himself, most often performed in the role of a Secutor. He considered this class the most courageous and aggressive, although his fights were, of course, carefully staged for safety. Real Secutors did not have the luxury of fixed matches. Their blood was truly shed. And although they were created as a countermeasure against one specific class, their influence on the development of martial arts is undeniable. They prove that narrow specialization often trumps versatility on the battlefield. Now, we turn to a class that shattered all the usual stereotypes about how a sword should work. Meet the Thraex, a gladiator named after the fierce tribes that lived in northeastern Greece. The Romans had a long and bloody history of wars with the Thracians, so they were more than happy to bring their image into the Colosseum arena. But this fighter's main draw wasn't his ethnic name, but the absolutely insane weapon he held in his hand. This guy used a scythe, a short sword with a blade curved like a boomerang, which completely changed the dynamics of combat. Why on earth would you need a curved sword in a world where everyone was used to stabbing with a straight gladius? Because the scythe was created for one specific, incredibly sneaky and effective purpose: to strike around the enemy's shield. When a Phrygian delivered a slashing blow, the curved blade would wrap around the edge of the opponent's shield and strike him right in the back or the back of the head. Sounds like cheating, doesn't it? It really disrupted the usual tactics of heavy fighters, who were used to feeling completely safe behind their wooden walls. Because of this cunning weapon, the Thracians' protective gear was slightly heavier than that of ordinary agile gladiators. He carried a small square shield, a parma, which could not cover his entire body, but was highly maneuverable. To compensate for the small size of the shield, the Thracian's legs were protected by two tall greaves that reached almost to his thighs. This made his stance more confident, allowing him to block low strikes without lowering his tiny shield. He was a hybrid, not as heavy as a Murmillo, but not as defenseless as a Retiarius. The Thracian's helmet was also a true work of art and had its own unique, recognizable detail. A figure of a griffin, a mythical creature associated with Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, always stood atop its crest. The helmet's wide brim provided excellent protection against blows from above, while the visor offered a decent field of view for maneuvering. It was perhaps the most stylish helmet in the entire arena, and spectators could always easily recognize the Thracians by their proud griffins. They looked like true ancient superheroes with their signature logo on their heads. The Thracians' main and most formidable enemy was always the heavy and unwieldy Murmillo. This matchup was a classic of the genre, like a Real Madrid versus Barcelona game, which spectators were ready to watch over and over again. The Murmillus hid behind his massive shield, while the Thracian leaped around, trying to strike him with his curved scythe. It was a battle of geometry, a right angle against a curved line, a solid wall against a cunning hook, and the crowd went wild, trying to guess whose approach would prove more deadly on this particular day. The Thracian's tactic was to apply constant pressure to the upper part of his heavy opponent's shield. He delivered dozens of quick, deceptive strikes, forcing the Murmillo to raise his shield higher and higher to protect his head. And as soon as the shield rose, exposing the legs, the Thracian would sharply change his angle of attack and strike with his scythe from the bottom up. This required incredible coordination and joint mobility because the scythe only worked with perfect timing. One miscalculation of distance, and the blade would simply have slid off the wood, leaving the Thracian open to a counterattack. Modern experts in historical fencing, who attempted to reconstruct the technique of wielding the scythe, were completely shocked. It turned out that this curved sword inflicted wounds that were nearly impossible to suture under the field conditions of that time. Ragged, curved cuts healed much worse than clean stab wounds from a straight Roman sword. That is why the Thracians were considered among the most brutal and bloodthirsty fighters, leaving behind horrific mutilations. And it was precisely for this brutality that the Roman crowd loved them with a mad, bloodthirsty passion. Interestingly, the famous Spartacus, the man who made the entire Roman Empire tremble, fought in the arena precisely in the Thracian class. His curved blade became a symbol of the uprising, although in actual warfare, such swords were used quite rarely. On the battlefield, formation is key, but the Sika is a weapon for the individualist, created exclusively for one-on-one duels. And in these duels, the Thracian proved a simple truth. Even the thickest wall can be bypassed if you have the right tool. This was a class for those who preferred cunning to brute, straightforward force. If you think all gladiators just swung swords, it's time to meet a guy who preferred to keep his distance. The Hoplamachus is a class created as a parody of the classical Greek hoplite, the historical enemy of the ancient Romans. His main weapon was a long spear, which made him a real thorn in the side of any fighter wielding a short sword. This gladiator played his own game, forcing his opponent to risk his life for every step forward. Modern MMA fighters would call him an outfighter, someone who controls the distance and strikes from afar. The Hoplamachus spear, called a hasta, was not designed for throwing. It was a heavy, sturdy weapon for thrusting strikes. The spear's length gave him a massive advantage over any sword, allowing him to attack while remaining completely safe. He could stab the enemy in the legs, face, or arms, forcing them to constantly flinch and lose their balance. It was an exhausting style that drove opponents to a fever pitch with its elusiveness. The Hoplamachus was like a wasp that constantly stings you, but dodges your clumsy attempts to swat it. In his left hand, this ancient sniper held a small, round shield forged from thick bronze. This shield was heavier than a Thracian's wooden parma, but much sturdier, allowing him to use it as brass knuckles. If an opponent did manage to break through the spear's reach, the Hoplamachus would strike him with this bronze disc right in the face. He also carried a spare short dagger on his belt in case the spear broke or got stuck in an enemy's shield. He was armed to the teeth and ready for combat at absolutely any range, which made him extremely versatile. His armor was also unique and designed with the constant use of a long spear in mind. Since he stood sideways to the enemy, his right arm and right leg were protected by heavy greaves and a sleeve. His back and left side, however, remained virtually exposed, requiring the fighter to maintain perfect positional control in the arena. The Hoplamachus could not allow the enemy to get behind him. Otherwise, his advantage in weapon length would instantly turn into a disadvantage. This required perfect footwork and constant movement in a circle, like the hand of a clock. Most often, the organizers pitted the Hoplamachus against our old acquaintance, the heavy Murmillo. This was a historical reenactment of the battle between the Greek phalanx and the Roman legion, which conservative patricians loved so much. The Murmillo tried to advance slowly, shielding himself with his massive shield, while the Hoplamachus showered him with a barrage of quick spear thrusts. The spectators watched with bated breath to see if the spear would break against the Roman shield or if the legionary would succumb to the long-range pressure. It was a perfect example of how the empire turned its real military history into mass entertainment. The biggest problem for the Hoplamachus was the limited space in the amphitheater arena. In an open field, a man with a spear can retreat indefinitely, wearing the enemy down to death. But the Colosseum had circular walls. Sooner or later, the Hoplamachus would find his back pressed against the stone wall, and then he would have to engage in close combat. It was in these moments that true mastery was revealed. The fighter had to drop his long spear at the right moment and draw his dagger. This transition from long range to close quarters was the most dangerous moment, one in which many novices were caught out. But those who mastered this class to perfection became true nightmares for any swordsman of the empire. They could strike with their spears with such force that they pierced even the thick wood of enemy shields, reaching right down to the hand. Hoplamachus were elegant, precise, and calculating. Their style tolerated no fuss or unnecessary rash movements. In a world where most fighters relied on fury and brute strength, this guy won through geometry and cold calculation. And the crowd appreciated this intellectual, cool-headed approach to the brutal art of killing on the sand. If you look at all the previous gladiators, you'll notice one common, rather frightening detail. Their chests and stomachs were always completely bare, exposed to fatal wounds for the amusement of the bloodthirsty crowd. But the Provocator broke this cardinal rule of the gladiatorial show. He was the only class to wear real armor on his chest. This piece was called a cardiophylactum, a metal plate that protected the heart and upper lungs from direct blows. And this radically changed the entire mechanics of the fight, turning it into a completely different kind of bloody sport. Why on earth would anyone be allowed to wear body armor in a world where spectacular blood spurting from the abdomen is prized? The fact is that provocateurs almost never fought against other classes of fighters. They were pitted exclusively against each other to show the audience a fair duel between opponents of absolutely equal strength. Two heavily armored men with identical weapons entered the arena to determine which of them possessed the better technique. It was pure sport in the modern sense, without any imbalance or cunning tricks involving a net or a spear. In addition to a breastplate, the Provocator wore a helmet that closely resembled a legionnaire's gear, but with a closed visor. He was armed with a short gladius sword and a medium-sized rectangular shield, which he maneuvered skillfully in combat. Because of their chest armor, these fighters could afford to make mistakes that would be fatal for others. They weren't afraid of taking an accidental jab to the chest, so their fighting style was the most aggressive and assertive in the arena. They charged head-on, exchanging powerful blows like heavyweights in the final round of a championship bout. The very name Provocator translates as one who challenges, and their fights often opened the day's gladiatorial program. They stepped onto the sand, tapped their swords against their shields, and provoked one another with insulting gestures to the delight of the crowd. Their fights lasted the longest because piercing a metal plate with a short gladius was incredibly difficult and exhausting. To kill a provocator, one had to strike with a sword into the narrow gap between the edge of the armor and the neck or strike at the groin. This required surgical precision in the midst of a frenzied, exhausting brawl between two men clad in steel. That is precisely why the duels staged by the provocateurs were considered the most technically skilled and professional among fencing connoisseurs in Rome. There was no room here for flukes or exotic weapons. Only those with the best command of the fundamentals emerged victorious. Spectators closely watched the footwork, the timing of parries, and the ability to find microscopic gaps in the defense. Modern boxing fans who enjoy watching technical exchanges of blows without knockouts would appreciate the provocateurs for what they were. They were the true workhorses of the arena, proving their mastery through sweat and blood in long, grueling bouts. But the armor also had a downside, a rather brutal one for the gladiator himself in the heat of the Italian summer. The metal plate on the chest prevented deep breathing, compressing the rib cage with every sudden movement the fighter made. Combined with a heavy shield and helmet, this caused the gladiators to burn through their oxygen at a catastrophic rate. Toward the end of the match, they could barely stand, leaning on their shields and gasping for the scorching air. And then the fight turned into a test of sheer willpower. Whoever fell first from exhaustion was the loser. Remarkably, it was the provocator's equipment that became the basis for many training methods in the Roman army. Legionnaires watched these fighters and learned how to properly conserve their strength during protracted battles in armor. The provocateurs served as a bridge between the theatrical spectacle of the arena and the real, harsh reality of the Roman military machine on the frontiers. They proved that even with identical weapons and armor, the man with the better technique would always emerge victorious. It was a lesson in discipline, packaged as brutal and bloody entertainment for the masses. Now forget everything you knew about defense, shields, and cautious tactics, because we're moving on to absolute madness. The Dimachaerus is a gladiator who consciously abandoned all defense in favor of double the firepower. His very name literally translates from Greek as the one who carries two swords, and that perfectly described his essence. This guy had neither a massive scutum, nor a small parma, nor even a simple wooden buckler to parry blows. Instead, he clutched a sharp blade in each hand, turning himself into a living, relentless meat grinder in the arena. In modern pop culture, dual-wielding swords looks cool, but in reality, it's an incredibly difficult and dangerous style. The human brain struggles to coordinate the independent movements of two arms wielding heavy weapons simultaneously in a stressful situation. Most people would simply get tangled up in their own blades or leave their chest open to a fatal blow within the first second. but Dimachaerus trained for years so that their left hand would work just as deadly and quickly as their right. They were true ambidextrous killers, capable of attacking and defending from any, even the most unlikely angles. Since the Dimachaerus had no shield, his body was protected only slightly more than that of ordinary light gladiators. He wore thick padded wraps on both arms and legs, and sometimes donned chainmail so as not to die from the very first scratch. The Dimachaerus' helmet covered his face completely because he had no way to shield himself from a chopping blow to the head. But even with this equipment, every time he entered the arena was a game of Russian roulette with incredibly high stakes. He couldn't block heavy blows. He could only parry them with his swords or dodge them using his speed. The Dimachaerus' tactics were built on a stunning, relentless attack that broke the spirit of any opponent. One sword was always used to deflect the enemy's weapon or shield to the side, creating a small opening. In the same split second, the second sword delivered a fatal blow to the exposed area, giving the enemy no time to react. It was a flurry of steel, a hail of blows that rained down on the opponent from all sides without a single pause for breath. The opponent was simply bewildered, not knowing which blade to watch, and inevitably made a fatal mistake. Who did the Romans pit against such an unconventional and terrifying fighter to maintain the show's balance? Most often, the Dimachaerus fought against a heavily armed Murmillo or a cunning Hoplamachus with his long spear. Fighting a Murmillo was like trying to open a can with two can openers at the same time. Difficult, but possible with the right skill. The Dimachaerus would leap around the massive shield, striking from above and below simultaneously, forcing the heavy fighter into a panic. If he managed to hook the edge of the shield with one sword and pull it back, the second blade instantly found its target. Interestingly, Dimachaerus were a great rarity in the arenas, and their performances were always paid at the highest rate. Training such a fighter was incredibly expensive and time-consuming, and they died much more often than the rest due to the lack of a shield. But when a Dimachaerus stepped onto the sand, the spectators rose from their seats because they knew a real bloodbath was about to begin. These fighters were the elite, the rock stars of the gladiatorial world, whose bravery bordered on absolute, primal madness. They proved that the best defense in a brutal world is an attack that the enemy is physically incapable of surviving. While all the other gladiators trampled the sand with their sandals, these men looked down on them from their saddles. The Equites, or mounted gladiators, were the true aristocrats of the arena, opening the most spectacular and expensive games in the empire. Their very name directly refers to the equestrian class, the Roman nobility that historically served in the cavalry. They rode into the arena on magnificent horses, adorned with feathers and bright tack, to the deafening roar of the enthusiastic crowd. It was the beginning of any good show, beautiful people on beautiful animals, ready to kill each other for entertainment. The Equites always fought only against each other, just like the Provocators, maintaining the strict balance of a cavalry duel. Their main weapon at the start of the battle was a light spear, which they hurled at each other at full gallop. Imagine a jousting tournament, but without heavy armor and at much higher, insane speeds around a circular amphitheater. If the lance missed its target, the Equites would draw short swords and begin circling on their horses, attempting to strike the opponent with their blades. This required not only fencing skills, but also incredible horsemanship without modern stirrups. These horsemen's armor was quite minimalistic, so as not to overburden the horse and to maintain maneuverability in battle. They had a flat, round shield of medium size and a helmet with wide brims, but without a high crest, so that weapons would not catch on it. A distinctive feature of their equipment was the tunic. Equites were among the few gladiators who did not fight bare-chested. They wore bright linen tunics that fluttered beautifully in the wind during the race, creating the perfect cinematic image. Spectators loved this visual contrast between the elegance of horseback riding and the brutality of the bloodshed. However, combat on horseback in the confined space of the arena almost always ended with someone falling to the sand. And this is where the most interesting and brutal part of the duel began, the part the bloodthirsty crowd had been eagerly awaiting. As soon as one Equite found himself on the ground, the other was obliged to dismount to continue the fight on equal terms. There was no finishing off of a dismounted rider by a mounted one. This was considered dishonorable and contradicted the strict rules of the Roman spectacle. The duel turned into a furious foot-to-foot brawl with short swords, where yesterday's elegant horsemen fought like common thugs. The Equites horses were also specially trained for this brutal and noisy environment, which cost the Lannis a fortune. An ordinary horse would have gone mad from the roar of tens of thousands of spectators, the smell of blood, and the clang of clashing steel. But these war horses remained calm, precisely following their riders' commands even in the most critical moments of the duel. Often, school owners cherished these animals more than the gladiators themselves, because finding a good horse was more difficult. The Equites were the elite, whose combat set the tone for the entire day, warming up the crowd before the heavy infantry entered the arena. Their performances were a unique tribute to the traditions of the Roman army, where the cavalry was always considered a prestigious branch of the military. Spectators saw in them a reflection of noble warfare, though in essence it was simply murder for entertainment. The Equites combat reminded people of the glorious days of conquest, when Roman cavalry put barbarian hordes to flight. It was the perfect combination of speed, risk, and tradition, packed into the compact format of the gladiatorial arena. And it was precisely these battles that proved that the Colosseum offered not only bloodshed, but also a genuine, wild elegance. Gladiatorial combat was not just a bloody massacre, it was the pinnacle of the ancient entertainment industry, meticulously planned down to the last detail. The Romans took the basic human fear of death and turned it into a perfect, mathematically calibrated commercial product. They created a class system that worked flawlessly, balancing the fighter's strengths and weaknesses with ingenious precision. Each class was a counter to another. Every weapon was a piece in a grand game of chess to the death. This system was so perfect that it endured for hundreds of years, filling stadiums across the vast empire. Think about this in the context of our modern world, obsessed with balance in sports and video games. Developers today spend millions of dollars creating unique characters that will be interesting to the public and fair in combat. The Romans did the same thing, only their patches were new types of armor, and their testers were living people on the yellow sand. They realized that people aren't interested in watching perfect, invulnerable fighters. People are interested in watching weaknesses overcome. That is precisely why they gave one a giant shield and the other only a fishing net and an incredible will to live. These fighters, whether a steel-clad Murmillo or a nimble Retiarius, were true professionals in their grim trade. They trained for years so that their bodies would function like perfect machines, honed for a single, specific, deadly action. They understood the geometry of battle better than any modern mathematician, because a single miscalculation could cost them their lives. Their diet, their training regimen, their medicine, everything was designed to ensure they performed at their absolute best on the day of the decisive battle. They were the superstars of antiquity, whose names were scrawled on the walls of Roman cities from Britain to Egypt itself. Roman organizers knew when the audience wanted to see a grueling, exhausting brawl, and when they wanted a lightning-fast chase. They directed these fights, creating tension, intrigue, and a climax better than any modern Hollywood blockbuster with a multi-million-dollar budget. The Colosseum was not just a building, it was a perfect adrenaline-producing machine, where every cog was in its place, and the gladiators were the most spectacular, the most expensive, and the deadliest cogs in this colossal mechanism. Today, we view these events through the lens of time, often condemning the Romans for their incredible cruelty. But if we look closely, we will see many familiar traits in this system that still command our attention. The desire to witness a clash of opposites, the admiration for highly specialized skill, and the thirst for a spectacular show have not disappeared from our culture. The Romans simply took this concept to its absolute, terrifying, and mesmerizing historical limit before the eyes of the whole world. And that is precisely why the story of ancient Rome's most brutal gladiators still sends a chill down our spines.